This is the sermon I preached at church this morning. My phone decided only to record half of it, and even that half was interrupted by an incident with a statue of Mary falling off the wall. So I thought it was probably worth re-recording it from full. Ever since I became a dad, I've been a right sucker for films about parents and children. And by a right sucker, I mean that they bring me to tears. Now, I should point out one of the only times I do cry is when I'm watching films or in the cinema. But we're not just talking about weepy tearjerkers here. Yes, when I watched Room, every time Ma was reunited with Jack, I was sobbing. But I also cried at Paddington 2. Right at the beginning, only 5 minutes into it, in fact, when Uncle Gattuso and Aunt Lucy were trying to rescue the baby Paddington from going over the waterfall, I was already in tears. It didn't used to happen, my dear. I used to have quite a heart of stone, and nothing used to bring me to tears like this. But now if you show me an anxious parent and a child in peril, then I'm gone. It's one of the reasons I love this gospel reading. The gospel reading we heard at church this morning about Jairus' daughter. I love Jesus in it. I love this reading. I love that Jesus, when he hears that this little girl is ill, doesn't just and but he doesn't ask any questions. He comes right away. I love that he isn't put off by the cynical voices that he hears that say she is dead. I love the way he pushes through those who say this is just hopeless. I love Jesus' determination and his sense of purpose. I love how when Jesus gets there, he doesn't just chalk this up as another tragedy. I love the fact that he doesn't just hold up his hands and say, this is how the world is, how terrible. I love how awake he is to God in that moment, how he knows that new life is just around the corner for this little girl. I love how he's listening to the voice of life and hope in that moment. I love how Jesus gently takes the girl's hand. I love how Mark recalls the actual Aramaic words that Jesus spoke, one of the few times that he does that. I love how gentle Jesus is. I love the power and the strength of his words. I love how a softly spoken word of Jesus is enough to send death packing. I love that when the little girl wakes from death, the first thing that Jesus says is, go get her a snack. This story, these few verses from Mark's Gospel, is one of the reasons I am a Christian. I love it. I love Jesus in it. It's so full of life. It's so full of goodness. It's so full of humanity. It's so full of hope. You know, we all have these pictures of God in our head. Some that we learned when we were young, some when we were a bit older. Some are good and some are less helpful. But for me, this image of Jesus, determined and resolute, and yet stooping by the bedside of a little girl with words that restore life itself, this is an image of God I hold on to. But you know, we're supposed to be talking about the Old Testament, not about the Gospel today. This is actually the last Sunday we're going to be focusing on the Old Testament, and today we're looking at the book of Ezekiel, a reading about a valley full of dry bones. Now, guess what? I love this passage as well, but I'm not going to spend 5 minutes telling you about all the reasons why I love this one. So what I want to say today is something that's going to take a bit of unpacking, a bit of working out. Because what I want to tell you today is that the picture of God we get in Ezekiel isn't too different from the one that we got in Mark's Gospel. Now, on the face of it, I couldn't really be more wrong. You don't have to have read much of Ezekiel, and if you read any of it, well done, to figure out that God is more like a stern headmaster than anything else in that book. He keeps calling Ezekiel Earth mortal or son of man. He never seems to use Ezekiel's name. And now, well, he's brought him up to, it's an odd kind of place, to be honest, full of animal skeletons, a valley of bones. And God leads Ezekiel back and forwards to and fro. It's like God's given Ezekiel a good look at them. It's a pretty stark view of God. But that isn't the most important thing here, actually. The most important thing is the question God asks of Ezekiel. Son of man, God asks, can these dry bones live? Can these dry bones live? Look around you, Ezekiel. Look, see these bones. See how dry they are. See how they are lifeless. Can they live? Can this little girl live? That's the question. It's the question for our times. Can these dry bones live? There seem to be challenges all around us sometimes. I love our church. I love getting together with our church on a Sunday morning. But sometimes, we're not a big church. Sometimes we're not able to do the things that we'd like to be able to do. All around us, the church seems to be facing challenges. We're getting smaller. Finances are tighter. We would not be human. We would not have a heart for our church if we didn't wonder what's to become of us in 5 or 10 years' time. And outside our church, some of the difficulties just seem insurmountable. A global pandemic, the crisis of climate change, forgotten communities. And we just don't seem as strong, just don't seem as able as we used to be. Sometimes it can feel like we're walking up and down past the dry bones. And the question is, can these bones live? Can the church thrive in the years ahead? Can we as a global community meet the challenges of climate change? Can we make our society fairer, juster, kinder? Can these dry bones live? Can they? All reason, all logic, all common sense says no. And yet the voice of Ezekiel, his prophecy is carried on the wind. It's stirring something. And from far away, life begins to stir. From out of the depths, God begins to stir new life. Tendons and flesh and blood and skin, breath and thriving life from dry bones. You can only imagine what it was like for Ezekiel standing there. You can kind of imagine his heart stirring, hope beginning to course through his veins. The realization that the future is held by God. That, of course, is the point. This isn't about bones or flesh or tendons or anything like that. This is a picture, a symbol, a prophecy that points us and points Ezekiel to a greater truth. Can these bones live? Can our church thrive? Can we overcome the challenges we face as a community and as a society and as a world? And the answer is, with God, you bet we can. Of course, that doesn't mean we will. God is not the magical answer to our problems. He's not in the business of giving us a positive mindset. He isn't tinting our spectacles a lovely shade of rose. We can't look back to the example of Ezekiel and say, everything is going to be okay. I cannot promise you that the Church of England will survive. I cannot promise you that this pandemic is going to be over anytime soon. I cannot promise you that we're going to be able to set our greed and our self-interest aside and begin to heal the world around us. I cannot do that. But I can promise you hope. I can promise you that God is working all around us as we speak. I can promise you that he is stirring new life. I can promise you that God is working every day. I can promise you that God is working in our hearts every day. I can promise you that that day will come when all shall be well and all manner of things shall be well. I can promise you that despair and death and pain do not have the last word. The path of hope does not always run smoothly, but it cannot be stopped. For these bones can live. This girl is not dead. And the God who holds the future in his hands cares enough to stoop at her bedside. His words carry life itself. Amen.